Hello, I'm Lexi, and this is what you should know. I am so sorry I've been gone for so long. Believe me, it was not expected nor planned. Firstly, there was going to be a super interesting unsolved case that I was halfway through when I reached out to the family for some more information, and they forewarned me that there is actually currently movement on the investigation. So obviously, with the hope always being any unsolved cases that I cover end up being resolved and have an answer, I obviously did not want to hinder the movement of justice, so I had to scrap the case that I was working on, which I was most of the way through, so I had to start all over again with another case. And as I was starting to get into that, I ended up getting really sick with a chest infection from hell. So I've been out of action for quite a while. So I am finally here, and I have an interesting case for you that will cause you to pause and wonder if you really should accept a cup of tea and some sweeties from your grinning grandmother figure. This is what you should know about Caroline Grills. Caroline was born on the 19th of February, 1890, to George Mickelson and his wife at the time, Mary. Not a lot is known about Caroline's early life, but I have found that she was the oldest of 7 children. Sadly, Caroline's mother, Mary, passed away in 1900, just 2 years after the birth of her youngest daughter, Hannah. Years would appear to pass without incident, and on the 22nd of April, 1908, with the consent of her father, Caroline would marry Richard Grills at the Balmain South Registrar's office. Harold was a 22-year-old labourer, and Caroline, a 17-year-old tailoress, as it was listed on their official marriage certificate. Thank goodness for Ancestry.com, right? Not an ad, but if they want to sponsor me, by all means. The young couple would go on to have 4 sons and 1 daughter. Sadly, not all of their children would survive. Their daughter Evelyn would die around the age of 1. In 1940, her son William would die tragically at the age of 20 when he struck a cow on his motorcycle. And in 1943, her son Harold, also known as Wally, passed away after contracting typhoid fever while working as a lifeguard on Maralba Beach, either from handling a dead body or waste that had been washed onto the beach from an adjacent sewer. This would have been extremely difficult for Caroline, losing 3 of her children, but as it tends to go, it wasn't all bad. In 1927, Caroline's father would marry Christina Burns at the age of 69. This would have brought some peace and joy to the family, as George had been widowed 27 years earlier. This marriage would ultimately end in the death of George, where he then left his home to Caroline and her husband Richard. The catch of this inheritance was Caroline would have to wait for her stepmother to pass, as Christina had been given a lifelong tenancy in George's will. Unfortunately for Caroline, Christina was holding on and living. How dare she, right? As Christina drew closer to the age of 84, Caroline began to dedicate her time to her stepmother, selflessly providing an endless supply of tea and cakes that all had the same secret ingredient, thallium. Now, thallium was used at the time as a rat poison, but it was also used by less wholesome people to extinguish the lives of others. Thallium can affect your nervous system, lung, heart, liver, and kidney if large amounts are ingested for a short period of time. Temporary hair loss, vomiting, and diarrhea can also occur, and death may result after exposure to large amounts of thallium for short periods. And thallium can be fatal from a dose as low as 1 gram. With that in mind, it is no surprise that before the age of 85, Christina passed away from poisoning, with many believing that she had died from natural causes, especially since sweet old Aunt Carrie was there to take care of her with a warm smile and a hot cup of tea. It was shortly after this that Caroline and her husband moved into their new home and settled in. But this comfort would be short-lived, as she began to daydream about a home away from home, a holiday house, where she and her husband could escape and unwind. As luck would have it, A close family friend named Angelina Thomas had declared offhandedly on a number of occasions that her home in the Blue Mountains of Sydney would belong to Caroline and Richard upon her death. Realizing how easy it had been the first time with Christina, Caroline saw to it that she visited Angelina on a regular basis, always taking her home-baked goods, and of course, the thallium rat poison, simply known as Thorat. Sadly, just 3 weeks after Christmas of 1948, on the 17th of January, Angelina Thomas passed away at the age of 87. Another death that no one felt was suspicious. Caroline was thrilled with how her life had started to go in her 60s. 2 pieces of property, all at the low, low cost of her soul. In today's economy, that is also quite cheap. Unfortunately for Caroline, living the dream left her with too much time on her hands. Even with a large family filled with children and grandchildren to keep her busy. She was a caring soul, allegedly, and her favorite pastime was to care for those around her who were sick. However, it appeared that unwell family members were thin after the deaths of Christina and Angelina. Bored of these peaceful times, Caroline turned her lethal nurturing nature to her husband's brother-in-law, John Lundgren. Tragically, he fell ill and died while on holiday with the Grills. It was soon after that Caroline's sister-in-law, Mary Ann Mickleham, passed away due to a similar illness. Both Mary Ann and John developed sudden and strange cases of alopecia prior to their deaths, and Mary Ann also went blind. Concern spread amongst the families. However, despite the chance that the illness could be contagious, Caroline firmly stayed by the side of each family member as their health declined. Many found it so sweet that in an effort to nurse Mary Ann back to health, she spoon-fed her soups and casseroles that she had made. As time progressed, the now widowed Eveline Lundgren, wife of John Lundgren, became concerned as she began to exhibit the same symptoms as her spouse had. But luckily for her, once again, Caroline was on hand to make Eveline as comfortable as possible during this difficult time. The cups of tea Caroline brought her must have felt so calming, especially after her sight had failed. She eventually became so unwell that her family believed she too would die. And with that concern, rather than leave her in the care of Caroline, she was admitted to the hospital. Once under the care of doctors, Eveline miraculously improved, which was a huge relief to her family. However, during this time, Eveline's daughter, Christine, and son-in-law, John Downey, were falling victim to the same mystery illness and had also accepted cups of tea and cakes from Caroline. It was after Christine and John had fallen ill that Eveline returned home from the hospital and Caroline resumed her care for her. Would you be shocked if I told you that around this time, Australia had fallen under a craze for killing with thallium, and it had been splashed all over the news as each murder was found out? Due to the chronic rat infestation, problems in the overcrowded inner cities, and thallium's effectiveness as rat poison, it was easily available over the counter in New South Wales, where thallium sulfate was marketed as a commercial rat bait under the brand Thorat. In the paper around the time of Caroline poisoning those around her were the likes of Yvonne Gladys Fletcher, a housewife and mother of 2 from the inner Sydney suburb of Newton. She was charged and tried for the murder of both her first husband, Desmond Butler, and her abusive second husband, Bertrand Bluey Fletcher. There was also Ruby Norton, who was tried for the murder of her daughter's fiancé, Alan Williams. Allegedly, Ruby hated all the men in her family and she did not want Alan as a son-in-law. Ultimately, she was acquitted. And Beryl Haig, who was tried for maliciously administering thallium and endangering her husband's life. Beryl confessed to buying Thorat from a corner shop and putting it in her husband's tea because she wanted to, and I quote, "give him a headache to repay the many headaches he had given me in violent disputes." With these stories circulating openly, John became suspicious of Caroline and her alleged kindness. When interviewed, John Downey said that on the 20th of April, 1953, he returned home at midday and found Caroline there with his wife and Eveline. At lunch, Caroline asked if she could bring in the tea, and it was around this time he saw her pause and put something into the cup, of which she then brought into the room and placed in front of Eveline, and said, "This is yours, Eva." Being concerned, John chugged his tea, and when his mother-in-law had drunk about a quarter of her tea, he grabbed the cup and said, "I'll warm your tea for you, Mum." He took her cup into the kitchen, emptied the contents into an old cup, and pushed it behind the washing up dish. After lunch, he emptied the contents of the old cup into a clean jar and placed it on the shelf in the laundry. It was shortly after John witnessed the decline in his mother-in-law's health that he took the jar of tea government analysis department, and in May he learned that his mother was suffering from thallium poisoning, and it was with this confirmation that the alarm was raised. It was first recorded on the 12th of May 1953 that 63-year-old serial killer Caroline Grills was arrested with bail set at £1,000 with the attempted murder of Eveline. The bail amount was initially dropped to £300 due to Caroline's excellent character. I think that is what is most disturbing about her, if I'm honest. She was witnessed at the courthouse in the first instance, smiling and talking politely as if she had not killed and attempted to do so again. It is without surprise that Caroline pleaded not guilty to these charges and had every intention on fighting them. It appeared that the usually cruel press had taken a softness with Caroline, in the beginning at least, with article titles such as "Woman 63, Innocent of Poison Charges" and "Innocent of Poisoning Charges." But that softness wouldn't last as the case would progress, especially as the request for bail was soon squashed, and Caroline would be held in remand until June 10th, when the coroner's inquest would start. It was on that day that she was charged with having feloniously administered thallium to Christine Downey and her mother, Eveline Lundberg, with the intent to murder them both. And it was with that Caroline was remanded again until July 21st. Caroline and her lawyer would loudly and openly speak with the press, trying their hardest to prevent a guilty verdict. On the 9th of July, there was an article where Caroline was quoted as saying, "The police are going on circumstantial evidence. It is wicked, in those circumstances, for women to be kept in jail merely on circumstantial evidence the police may have got." But while they tried to play the world's smallest violin for themselves, testing was being complete, and post-mortem examinations had revealed large quantities of thallium in the bodies of 2 women. Unfortunately, they couldn't exhume all 5 bodies, as 3 had been cremated at the suggestion of Caroline. It would be a shock for many when Caroline was granted a £2,000 bail after her lawyer argued that her continued detention in Long Bay Jail was seriously affecting her health. The day this was granted, Caroline appeared in court wearing a long grey dress and black coat. It is reported that during this time she would stare at the floor and not look around the room at all until bail was granted. Once it was, that sinister grin spread across Caroline's face. Now to clarify, Caroline had been on bail for £300, was arrested on additional charges of murder after the bodies were exhumed and tested for thallium poisoning, and was let go on bail again, but this time for £2,000. That smile would inevitably land Caroline in trouble, as in the coming articles I found on Trove, she was warned multiple times by her own lawyer not to smile or laugh while evidence was being presented. The 12th of August was an interesting day for the inquest, as it started with Detective Sergeant Ferguson taking the stand. During this time, he would present the following evidence, starting with how traces of thallium had been found in a cup from which had been presented to Eveline by Caroline. Police had given the government analyst 2 oyster bottles, 1 containing oyster water, an envelope containing some of Eveline's hair, and biscuits, oysters and chocolate said to have been given to Eveline at the Sydney hospital by Caroline. The examination of the oysters had proven negative. However, the tea had contained thallium. He proceeded to explain that when he interviewed Caroline on the 11th of May, he expressed his belief that thallium had been administered to Eveline and Christine, and stated that when he further questioned Caroline about carrying cups of tea into the Lundberg home on the 20th of April, she had said, and I quote, "I might have sometimes, but only when Chrissy asked me to." Detective Sergeant Ferguson also said he had told Caroline, "Jack Downey alleges you walked into the kitchen, took 1 cup of tea and walked to the door where he saw you place your right hand in your pocket. You then placed the tea before Eveline." It was during this that the detective continued to explain to the court how Jack had taken the cup of tea from Eveline, claiming to want to warm it up for her. Next was Dr. Farah, who would provide further damning evidence that the grinning granny, Caroline, was in fact guilty of murder. Dr. Farah said from knowledge of medical history of Eveline Lundberg and inspection of the government analysis certificate, Eveline's illness was consistent with heavy metal poisoning such as thallium. This was followed by the testimony of Eveline's GP, Dr. Gabriel Stephen Nagy. According to his recollection, on the 17th of April 1952, Eveline had complained of sudden loss of vision that had been impacting her since 1951. This had been preceded by her hair falling out during June of the same year. Eveline also complained of cramp-like pains in her legs which occurred in December. In Dr. Nagy's opinion, her condition at the time was consistent with thallium poisoning. With this suspicion, Dr. Nagy confirmed that he visited her home to see whether poison had been accidentally injected. I triple-checked the relevant article to ensure that it didn't say ingested, as it does tend to show a little typed up section. But no, even in the actual article that had been photocopied, it says injected. Didn't realize people in the 1950s were just injecting themselves all willy-nilly. When he visited Eveline's home, he had found an empty Thorat container in her home, but it had evidently not been used for some time. On the 8th of May, he attended Eveline's home for a consultation and found her in a semi-comatose condition, having convulsions. He had arranged for her admission into the Sydney hospital, where she was discharged from on the 6th of June 1952. Dr. Nagy explained how he believed there was enough evidence to show that she was suffering from thallium poisoning during that period. He saw her again on the 3rd of August and stated that her condition was satisfactory, except that she was now totally blind, and the cause of blindness could be heavy metal poisoning. And then on the 29th of April 1953, he had seen Eveline with her daughter Christine at the Sydney Hospital Outpatients Department. He had been told her hair was falling out again. He had then ordered urine specimens to be submitted. Then it was the turn of Jack Downey, son-in-law of Eveline. While on the stand, Jack was quoted as saying the following: "I was suspicious of her. Aunt Carrie passed from the dining room to the lounge, where her right hand went across the front of her body in the direction of her left hand. She put her right hand straight back into her right hand pocket." Jack would continue to say how he saw his mother-in-law drinking from 1 cup. Shortly after, Caroline came back and rinsed the cups. It would be 9 days after his mother-in-law had drunk some tea from a cup brought by Caroline, her hair would start to fall out again. As many stories would come out, one came from Jean Esme Lane, daughter of Mary Ann Mickleham. She told the court that Caroline had told her that Eveline had lost her hair and gone blind just like her own mother. When she questioned her and said, "Don't you think that's strange?" she was met with Caroline's dismissive attitude. Caroline was quoted as saying, "No, they all go like that." When Jean stated that she felt like she should go visit Eveline, Caroline told her not to, allegedly, saying she will remind you too much of your mother. And it was with that Caroline Grills lost the right to her bail. In an odd twist, the reason for Eveline's attempted murder came to light in an article published on the 13th of August, 1953. And when I tell you it is wild, oh boy, I was a little bit shocked, to say the least. While Caroline had killed 2 people previously for houses, Eveline had been poisoned for her clothes. I'll let you soak that in for a moment. It was sometime before Christmas in 1951 that Caroline said to her dear friend Eveline that she had dreamt that she had died and left all her clothes to her. Eveline probably found this thought to be kind of amusing and replied by saying, "You're the only one they fit, so you'll get them." Now, Remember, Eveline survived this nightmare and was on the stand at some point explaining how things went from her perspective, and she was quoted as saying, "Caroline went inside to get water. No one asked for it, and I don't know how many cups she brought out because I couldn't see them. I just took the cup and drank the water. I'm supposed to drink plenty of water, so it didn't really make much difference." She recalled that Caroline had spoke to her while handing her the cup, but she couldn't remember the actual words. Eveline added that she didn't remember being taken to the Sydney hospital by Detective Sergeant Ferguson and Detective Crahi on the date of Caroline's arrest because she was unconscious. Christine would next explain her recollection, saying that Caroline would often bring foodstuffs and stay for lunch every Monday. On the day of the poisoning itself, she was cutting a sandwich in her kitchen with her back to the table where the cups of tea were. Caroline then said, "I will take the teas in for you." She then took 1 cup of tea directly out to Eveline and then returned for the other 3 cups. The days after that, Eveline's hair began falling out, but Christine's suspicion of Caroline went back to 1952, when she had become ill from being poisoned. Christine would go on to explain that one Sunday, toward the end of March or in early April, before the April tea poisoning, Caroline had brought a jam roll, a jar of ginger, and some pikelets to her home. She had told Caroline she was going out to her brother's place and would take the food there. Allegedly, Caroline said, "Don't take the jam roll. That's for your mother. I made it myself." When asked by Sergeant Hamilton what eventually happened to the jam roll, Christine said, "I opened it up and then put it in the dirt tin." Now, to explain that for those who have no idea what that is, it's a food scraps bin. Effectively, they just would have reused a large tin for this purpose back in the day. It was around this time that the press had turned against Caroline and started digging as deep as they could for real dirt, and they did not pull any punches. They published chunks of the interview Caroline had with the police, and besties, it did not look good at all. My favourite part was when Caroline was asked what Angelina Thomas died from. She replied, "Old age. She was 87. Caroline was then asked if she had offered any of Angelina's clothing to one Isabel Jones. Caroline had replied yes. I told her she could go and take whatever she wanted out of the house except for the hand sewing machine. Now, I know it does go that way after the death of someone. Items get split up amongst people, and some items even end up in second-hand stores. During the early 1950s, this would have been common practice because everyone was financially drained from World War II. Even more so here because Angelina Thomas was murdered in 1948. But the reason it doesn't sound so good is because I know what she did. Something about it just feels icky. Later in the coronial inquest, a woman by the name of Alice Hurry was brought to the stand as she had been attempting to help care for Angelina. Alice would testify that in her last days, Angelina's lips were so very dry, and she would often request to have them moistened. Being the late 1940s, I don't think they had chapstick, so I am unsure of what they would have done, or if they would have just given her some oil. It would make sense if maybe they put some oil on her lips. Don't know. Alice also stated that Angelina was thirsty all the time. Shortly before her death, Caroline gave Alice a prescription for Angelina. She brought the medicine back when Caroline or Marianne were there, but a few days later she saw the bottle on Angelina's bedside table, still looking full. When Angelina passed away, Alice went to find some flowers to leave with her body. However, she was shocked by what she saw upon her return. The undertaker had removed her body, and Caroline and her husband Richard were, and I quote, pulling the bed to pieces. Alice did clarify that she saw nothing sinister in their actions, and expected she would have done the same after death. Different times, I guess. Next on the stand was longtime neighbour Helena Schongbeck. Helena said that on one occasion, she set a rat trap for Angelina using a piece of meat as bait, as Angelina was nervous of the poison and feared that one of her chickens would eat it by mistake. This only grew the suspicions of the court as more than one empty bottle of thole rat had been seen at her home around the time of her death. Isabel Jones, who had been offered the items from Angelina's home post her death, also made a statement, as she was a neighbour and close friend to Angelina. Isabel had told the court that Angelina had advised her of a tin under her bed containing 30 pounds to be used in case of illness, and at Angelina's request, Isabel told Caroline of this. Isabel also told the court how she had made a dressing gown for Angelina some months before she had died. 2 days before her death, Caroline had shown her the dressing gown and asked if she would like to have it. She declined, understandably. I honestly can't even begin to imagine what would have gone through her mind when she was first asked. But this was so outrageous at the time that many people used this as a main point of contention in any of the articles, and it was a main point during the later court case. Finally, Isabel told of her last visit to Angelina before her death. She gave her some water, but had to hold her head up before she could drink. Angelina was blind at this point, but said she recognized her voice. Quoting what Isabel said directly while on the stand, she said, "She then whispered, 'I am going home.'" During mid-August, the inquest continued on, starting with a thallium tragedy that had occurred in Granada, where 14 children had died from poisoning, and how at the time Caroline commented on the tragedy, seeming to be heartbroken for the loss of life, a stark contrast to her grinning and laughing during court. In a strange moment, after the public had entered the courtroom, a woman ran across to Caroline, whose chair was just in front of the public barrier, put her arms around her neck, and kissed her on the cheek. It was witnessed that she had said to Caroline, "Good morning, dear, and good luck. How are you?" Caroline smiled, patted the woman's hand, and said she was well. The woman left Caroline and hurried to get a seat in the rapidly filling benches. Another woman, younger than the first, then ran across and also kissed Caroline, who smiled and said she felt fine. I guess many people wouldn't want to believe that this stoutly built woman with a permanent grin on her face would be capable of murdering 4 family members and attempting to murder a further 4. Reporters would continue to point out how Caroline seemed to show no remorse and was completely unmoved by the allegations. In one report, they would go on to describe her as well preserved and freshly complexioned at 63. They would comment that her fair hair is almost free from grey, and her hazel eyes light up when she smiles. These almost sound like love notes, showing infatuation for this murderer. They would explain how at the height of 4'10", her feet wouldn't touch the ground when she sat behind her lawyer. To read directly from one article, in her folded hands she clutches a gay floral scarf, which she affects to foil the press photographers. Each time she enters the courtroom, she wears a scarf around her hat and adjusts it again when leaving. She has enjoyed her forays and skirmishes with the eager cameramen, and once, when she reached the courtroom, leaving a trail of rueful photographers outside, she gasped, laughing, "It's the fun of the world." At each adjournment, Mrs. Grills has held a levee with friends and relatives who pack into the small courtroom. They laugh and joke with Aunt Carrie. Even on Thursday, when the coroner refused to renew her bail, Mrs. Grill's savoir-faire did not leave her. They really do speak of her like she is some kind of celebrity being cheeky with paparazzi. But I feel they may have briefly forgot that this woman, no matter how small or charming she is a vicious murderer, a comfort killer. What is a comfort killer, you ask? Well, it is someone who will kill for the sake of money and wealth. In Caroline's case, let's remember it also included clothing for some strange reason. It was reported in late August that Jean, the daughter of Mary Ann, had been called to testify again. Caroline had told the court that her sister-in-law had said, "Don't let those girls come near me. They're trying to kill me." Jean had told the court that she was suspicious but not prejudiced against Caroline, and that when Caroline had told her that her mother had not very much longer to live, she had consulted the family doctor, Dr. Bolton, who said it was not likely. However, shockingly, Mary Ann passed away at the predicted date that Caroline had given. Jean also added that she had seen Caroline wearing some of her mother's clothing, which she never paid her or her sister for. To put it bluntly, Caroline not only poisoned Mary Ann, but she also effectively did a subtle gloat for her work on that by predicting the date of death, and then stole a dead woman's clothing. During the court session, Caroline was told that she was going to be charged with the attempted murder of her niece Christine. Her response was to tell them that she didn't care. To further the horror that was this case, Caroline would make up excuses and scenarios and try to shift blame. As we have already heard, Caroline claims it was illness and age killing those around her. As for Jack Downey, she would go on to accuse him of being a cat killer, and that John Downey poisoned himself. And then on the 12th of August 1953, the coronial inquest was complete, and Caroline was charged with murder. The coroner said, "On the evidence before me, in this matter, I find that Christina Louise Adelaide Michelson died on November 30, 1947, at St. Margaret's Private Hospital, Gladsville, from poisoning by thallium, feloniously and maliciously administered to her by Caroline Grills. And I further find that Caroline Grills did feloniously and maliciously murder the said Christina Louisa Adelaide Michelson." She was then transferred from Long Bay Jail to Katoomba Police Station cells, where she was to wait out the week before the trial would start. While in Katoomba, it was found that the death of Angelina Thomas was the result of thallium, and her death would be added to Caroline's trial. Caroline would continue to protest her innocence, and her husband would stand right by her side the entire time. The first day of trial started as a circus. Half an hour before the doors opened for the public, a long queue of people stood outside the court, waiting to witness the trial themselves. Caroline entered the court by the side door under police escort. She walked, smiling, to the dock and turned to face Justice Brereton. And when the indictment was read, she answered, "Not guilty," in a clear, firm voice. And so the trial began, and I will only tell you the highlights, as it's all going to be much of the same of the information that was brought up during the inquest. Crown Prosecutor Mr. Rooney told Justice Brereton that if he pressed for a motive for the poisonings in Redfern, he would say Caroline Grills had become a practiced and habitual poisoner. Possibly she was getting a psychological lift and sense of power from administering poison and watching its effects. While the evidence for motive for most poisonings were weak, as stated by Justice Brereton, the press printed their opinion while the trial was in its third day that it was only expected to last a week. And they were not wrong. Weak evidence of motive really did not impede the course of justice with this case. Towards the end of the trial, Justice Brereton read George Mickelson's will, and if you have forgotten already, that's okay, George is Caroline's father. Justice Brereton said the effect was that if Mrs. Christina Michelson no longer lived, Justice Brereton said that if Mrs. Christina Michelson lived longer than her husband, the property would go to Caroline, subject to allowing the widow to live in the Mickelson's house at Gladsville. If Christina died first, the property went directly to Caroline after George died. In any case, nothing could happen until George Mickelson died. Christina had been complaining of sore knees, aching hands, and failing sight. Her hair had also fallen out. Mrs. Carr, close friend of Christina, had said Caroline often looked after her, preparing and cooking lunch for her. Caroline also told her that Christina had been pulling out her own hair, saying, "You know, she is getting silly." Caroline said to her, "Grandma is old, she will not recover," and also added that she thought cremation was a better option. Mrs. Carr told the court, "I thought she should be buried with her mother," and she was. Caroline clapped back and is quoted as saying, "You don't know this, Mrs. Carr, but I do. I don't want to cause trouble, but she had a daughter to one of Mrs. Mickelson's sons, and she thought that the daughter should have got grandfather's cottage, which we are living in now. I don't see why she should get that. Grandfather didn't marry until he was 76, and there are 4 of us girls who should have got it." Caroline would continue to give her highly sanitized testimony in her own defense, claiming how she would never hurt anyone. When asked about Tholrat, she explained she had no idea that the popular rat poison contained thallium, and that any food she prepared was eaten by everyone, including herself. So if she had poisoned it, she too would have fallen ill. On the 15th of October, 1953, the jury was excused to deliberate the verdict of the case. They took a total of 12 minutes before returning with a guilty verdict. When Caroline returned to the dock to await the decision, she stood nervously, swallowing and tapping the rails with her fingers. When she heard the verdict, she shrugged her shoulders and gave a wry smile. She then threw her head back and smiled broadly. Justice Brenton was then quoted as saying the following: "The jury has found you guilty of administering poison to Mrs. Lundberg with the intent to murder. The evidence discloses that under the guise of friendship and loving kindness, but apparently motiveless malignity, you administered poison to her, condemning her at least to a life of blindness and possibly death. I direct that sentence of death to be recorded." Caroline turned to the police standing outside the dock and said, "Is that all?" This bitch really did not care at all. Sentenced to death, and all she could say is that all? Caroline appealed, and while this was dismissed by the Court of Criminal Appeal, her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. She served her sentence at the State Reformatory for Women for the next 6.5 years, where she became affectionately dubbed by other inmates as Aunt Thally. In 1960, Caroline died. She was rushed to Prince Henry Hospital and later died of peritonitis. Peritonitis is something I had to Google. It is an inflammation of the abdominal lining that surrounds your internal organs. That is usually caused either by a separate infection, an injury, or internal leakage. She was cremated with Anglican rites, attended by her husband and surviving children. And on that note, that's all I have for you today. Thank you all so much for being so patient for this episode. I really do appreciate it. Hopefully there will be no more delays and we can all move on from this. There will be relevant pictures on Facebook and Instagram at What You Should Know Australia. If you want to request episodes or just reach out, please contact me through my social media, or you can email me at whiskerpod@gmail.com. That is wyskapod@gmail.com. If you can, like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, and rugby tackle that 5-star button. But until next time, stay safe and stay hydrated. Bye!